If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
Okay, so in this video, we're going to deal with the first part of the conditional logic basics for the test. So, what exactly is conditional logic? So, a more specific question, what is the nature of conditional logic? In what way do conditional statements appear on the test? And what do we know on the basis of conditional statements? So that's what we're going to cover. So, conditional logic. If-then statements are combinations of two statements, also called conditions, with a specific relationship between them. That's what a conditional statement is. That's what conditional logic deals with. It deals with if-then statements. And they are these statements which are a combination of two statements and have a specific relationship. So if we look at this specific statement over on the right, it says, if you study hard for the LSAT, then you will improve your score. So those are the two statements. The statements are studying hard for the LSAT. So we can take a look, just sort of focus on it here, studying hard for the LSAT, and then improving your score. That's the second statement. And conditional logic deals with the relationship between those two statements. Now, that relationship can best be understood as the relationship found in rules. And by rules, I just mean what we intuitively and generally understand as a rule, what we would have encountered in everyday life. Rules in school, rules in rules in the road, etc. Basically, a rule tells you that when a particular scenario is true, a consequence has to follow. So think of all the rules that you've ever encountered. If you drive over the speed limit, then you're going to get a ticket. If you don't set your alarm, then you're going to wake up late. All rules basically tell you that there's a situation, which is a scenario, which is some sort of situation, and then if that situation is true, there's going to be a consequence. So that's what I want you to keep in mind. So something activates a rule, and something is a consequence of a rule. That's another way of looking at it. And if we look at over on the right, we can say that studying hard, this is a rule. If you study hard, then you'll improve your score. Then studying hard is what activates that rule, and the consequence of studying hard is that you will improve your score. Whenever the activation part is true, the consequence part has to be true. So this is very important. You want to keep that in mind. This is basically the relationship. There's the activation, there's the consequence. Whenever the activation is true, the consequence part has to be true. In other words, you can never have a situation where the activation is true, but the consequence isn't. So if you were given this rule on the LSAT and they say if you study hard for the LSAT, then you will improve your score, you can never have a situation where somebody did study hard, but they did not improve their score. That is what a conditional relationship says. When the activation part is true, the consequence has to be true. Now, that looking at this particular example, you might be like, well, that's not always true. But on the LSAT, when you're given a conditional rule, you generally take it as given to be true, even if you can think of counterexamples. So in this specific case here, you might be like, well, I know plenty of people who studied hard for the test, but they didn't improve their score for whatever reason. And that's certainly true. Maybe they had a bad day, maybe they didn't study the right material, etc. But that is generally not going to be the issue. Sometimes, and in future lessons, I'll definitely point out when you want to be on the lookout for that and when you want to be critical of the truth of a rule, whether or not it's something that actually does hold, whether it's a good rule, but they generally do not care about that in the test. Generally speaking, what they're trying to test you is not your ability to evaluate whether a rule is true, whether a rule is a good rule, but what the logical consequences are of that rule in combination with other rules, in combination with other information. So generally, whenever you see a rule, just accept it as this is a true rule. This is given. So whenever the activation part is true, I know that the consequence is going to be true. In this case, if I know that somebody's studying hard for the test, I know they will improve their score. Okay, but like I said, in future lessons, we'll go into that in a lot more detail. Now, what I have here is a causal relationship, but you want to keep in mind that the relationship is not necessarily causal. It could also just be one of truth falsity. So it could be causal, like I said, and this is an example of that. Studying hard causes you to improve your score. So this being a rule, it's a causal rule, meaning if it's activated, then there's going to be a causal consequence. There's going to be an effect. The consequence is an effect of the activation. So studying hard causes you to improve your score. Although you want to keep in mind that it could also go the other way. So here we have another rule. If there's smoke, then there's fire. It's not that the smoke causes the fire. It's that the smoke indicates that there's a fire. It's what we had talked about in the previous lesson about explanations and indexicals. The fire is actually what has caused the smoke. So you can have a causal relationship where the activation part, the if part, is actually the evidence for the then part or for the consequence part, and the consequence part is the causal mechanism by which you get the if part. So this is still a causal relationship. It's just that the fire is what's causing the smoke, and it's if there's smoke that indicates that there was a fire which caused it. You can think of it that way. So these are the two common ways in which you will get causal relationships in if-then statements. But it could also be constitutive. So it doesn't necessarily have to be causal. So for example, we have a situation here that if you live in New York City, then you live in the United States. It's not like living in New York City causes you to live in the United States. It's that living in New York City constitutes that you live in the United States. So this is also something that appears with some frequency. So the reason I'm pointing this out, and you don't have to worry too much about this, you don't have to be too focused on this, is just that I just want you to remember that when you see if then, it's not necessarily a causal relationship, as we see here with the last example. Now, the other thing that you want to keep in mind is that symbolizing these conditional statements make them a lot easier to work with. So in future videos, in future lessons, we'll have several more lessons on conditional statements and exactly what it means to work with them. So don't worry about that so much. But basically what you'll be doing is, depending on the question, you're going to be using this rule in combination with other information to see what else has to be true, what can't be true, etc. And in order to do that, the best way to do that is to simply start symbolizing, start diagramming stuff out, and the standard way of doing that is with this arrow. So what you would do is you would take, so for example, this is a symbolization of, so this is a symbolization of this first argument. What you would do, or this first statement, is what you would do, you would take the I'm jumping ahead, you would take the if part, the activation part, if you study hard, you would symbolize it, and here I'm just, or rather study hard for the LSAT, and here I'm just putting study LSAT. Then you would put an arrow, and then you would put the then part. You will improve your score. You put that to the right side of the arrow. And that's the standard way of doing it. The left side of the arrow is the if part of the statement, or the if statement. And the right side of the arrow, after the pointy bit, is the then part of the statement. And it means exactly the same thing. This is just simply a visual way of representing this particular sentence. And this is going to make a little bit more sense when we get to future videos, when you see what exactly we are doing with conditional statements. Also, what you want to remember is that on the test, and this is what I briefly mentioned, on the test, conditional statements primarily function as rules, and what that means is they're applied to specific situations. So what that more concretely means is that the structure of these statements is that it's essentially a conditional rule, which you'll encounter is essentially a conditional rule plus additional information. So you'll be given a rule, and you'll be given additional information, and then your job is to deduce if there's anything else that has to be true on the basis of the rule plus additional information. So for example, we have the statement we've been working with, that if you study for the LSAT, then you're going to improve your score. And then we're also told that Jane is studying for the LSAT. So if we're told that if you study for the LSAT, then you're going to improve your score, and then we're additionally told that Jane is studying for the LSAT, this is a common way in which this works. What we're generally going to have to figure out here is, okay, what else has to be the case? Now remember, what did we say? We said that what is a conditional relationship? The conditional relationship is that when the if part is true, the then part has to be true. So if we know that this part is true, that somebody is studying for the LSAT, we also know that this has to be true, that they're going to improve their score. Now, once again, we're taking the statement as true. We're not being critical of the rule itself or of the statement. We're just assuming that it's true. So if that's the case, if we know that whenever this left part is true, the right part has to be true, and we know that Jane is studying for the LSAT, so that means for her it's true. She is studying for the LSAT. Well, if we know that she's studying for the LSAT, then we know that her score is definitely going to improve. She has to improve her score. And this is an application of the rule. Jane studying for the LSAT activated that rule because the if part is shown to be true. She's studying for the LSAT. And so that means that the consequence has to be true for that rule as well for her. So she has to improve her score. And this is essentially how you're going to encounter this on the test. With some variations, and we'll go over them, but this is basically, in a sort of fundamental sense, you've got the rule plus additional information. So this is what I was saying. When the if part is true, the then part has to be true. That means that it activates the rule, and so the consequence is automatically true. And that's what we see here. Jane studying for the LSAT. That means that Jane improved her score. And this is what I kind of unfortunately briefly mentioned a couple of minutes ago. The technical term for the if part is the sufficient condition. And this is something that comes up on the test, so that's why I introduce it. The if part being true, and the reason it's called a sufficient condition is because the if part being true is sufficient, and sufficient just means enough, or that's all you need. It's sufficient for the then part to be true. So you can think of it as the activation condition, you can think of it as the if condition, or the technical term which appears in the test, and it's a term from logic, is the sufficient condition. Okay, so this is, once again, just a quick recap, this is how this works. The rule plus additional information, and then you're trying to see, is there anything that has to be true? And in this case, because we know that a conditional statement or a conditional relationship means that whenever the if part is true, the then part has to be true, and we were given an example, a concrete example of the if part being true, so now we know, we can deduce that the then part in that concrete example has to be true as well. And that was a pretty straightforward example because studying for the LSAT and doing well is fairly intuitive, but I've pulled up a couple of obscure medical conditions here. So basically what I'm symbolizing here is that if you have nyctalopia, you have xerophthalmia. I honestly have no idea what any of these mean. They're just obscure medical conditions. And there's a reason I'm doing this, is because this is what you'll encounter on the test. They'll give you rules that you either have no context for and no sort of understanding of exactly what the specific details mean. And the reason they do that is because they want to test your ability to just look at the logic. So here the statement is basically saying, if you have this nyctalopia, you have xerophthalmia, and then you're additionally told that Jane has nyctalopia. Well, what do you know? Well, the same exact thing. The fact that Jane has nyctalopia, you know that activates the rule, and so what does that mean? The consequence is automatically true. So if she has nyctalopia, then you know she definitely has xerophthalmia, regardless of what these obscure medical conditions actually mean. You don't have to know that. All you have to know is that the rule is true, and because it's a rule, because it's a conditional relationship, if the if part of this or the sufficient condition is true, and we know it's true since she has nyctalopia, the then part has to be true as well. Okay, and I bring that up, like I said, on purpose, because this is what's going to appear a lot in the test. You'll be given these rules that you don't have any context for understanding, so you just need to focus on the logical relationship between them. Now, let's go back to this previous rule. So we have a situation here that, once again, same rule. If you're studying for the LSAT, then you will improve your score. But what do we know? We know that Jane did not improve her score. So we're given that additional information. So this is something that will be given. We're given the rule, and then this is another potential kind of information we could be given, and that is that Jane did not improve her score. Now the question is, does that tell us anything? Well, what you know is that when the then part is not true, the if part can't be true. So you know for a fact that Jane did not study for the LSAT. Now why is that? Well, simply because if the consequence isn't true, then the rule hasn't been activated. And once again, that's by definition, because remember what we said, by definition, the conditional relationship is that whenever the rule is activated, the consequence has to be true. But if you know that the consequence isn't true, there's no way that the rule has been activated, because if it was activated, the consequence would be true, and you'd have that contradiction. You can't have a situation where Jane did not improve on her score, but she did study for the LSAT, because according to the way they set it up on the test, if it's a rule and we accept it as true, then if she studied for the LSAT, she had to have improved her score, because studying for the LSAT is sufficient for that. So you can't have a situation where you know she did not improve her score, but she studied for the LSAT, which means she did improve her score, so she actually both improved and did not improve on her score. That's why whenever you're told that the then part isn't true, you know that the if part can't be true either, because simply put, the if part would have automatically led to it. Okay? And the reason, and for example, that's something that in that particular situation is a causal relationship, but you can see maybe a little bit more clearly here, because a lot of times students will say, well, maybe she studied, but she didn't do well for other reasons. Once again, what you're doing there is you're intuitively criticizing or challenging the validity of the rule when you should accept it as true, if that's the kind of question type. But for example, in something like this, where it's a little bit more obvious, if you live in New York City, then you live in the United States. If Jane does not live in the United States, well, here most students will find this a lot more obvious, that, well, there's no way she could live in New York City. There's no sort of counterexample to her living in New York City, or rather her living in New York City but not living in the United States. So this is a sort of more intuitive and obvious example of this kind of relationship, where if the then part, or the right part of the arrow, is not true, then you know that the if part is not true either. And we'll go back to this in a little bit more detail with respect to some of the kind of intuitive problems students might have with a causal relationship, but it's a little bit more obvious here in this constitutive relationship. So once again, there's a technical term, and the technical term for the then part is necessary condition. And the reason for that is because the then part always has to be true when the if part is true. So if you know the if part is true, then you know of necessity, you know that it's a requirement, you know that it has to be true that the then part is true as well. Okay, so this is the second major way in which you'll have conditional reasoning and conditional statements used on the questions. The first is they'll give you a conditional statement, and then they'll give you a piece of information which activates it, and so you know that the consequence, or the then part, has to be true. And the second way is where they'll give you a conditional statement, and then they'll show you that the consequence did not happen. So if you live in New York City, then you live in the United States. Jane does not live in the United States, so that consequence to that rule didn't happen, so you know it hasn't been activated. And those are the two major ways in which the conditional statement plus additional information is used in the test in order for you to figure out what else can be true or cannot be true. Okay. Additionally, and this is something that is related to what we just did, you can actually rewrite every conditional starting with the negative of the necessary condition and leading to the negative of the sufficient. So we have our conditions here, that the statements, the conditional statements that we've been working with. If you're studying for the LSAT, then you'll improve your score. If there's smoke, then there's fire. If you live in New York City, then you live in the United States. And for each one of them, you can actually rewrite them in this way. So for the first one, it says if you study the LSAT, you'll improve your score. Well, you can also say that if you don't improve your score, then you didn't study LSAT. For the second one, you can say if there's no fire, then there's no smoke. And the third one, if you don't live in the US, then you don't live in New York City. And the reason for that is because it's still actually the same conditional rule. You're just looking at it from the perspective of what happens if the consequence isn't true. And the reason you can do that is because that's just by definition what a conditional relationship is. A conditional relationship says that whenever the activation is true, so whenever the if part is true, the then part has to be true as well. The consequence has to be true as well. And you can look at that and say, well, okay, what that means is if the sufficient, or if the if part is true, then the then part is true. But you can also look at it and say, well, okay, then if the then part is not true, then the if part can't be true either. You can't actually have activated the rule. What I want you to remember is that every time you see a conditional statement, you can simply flip and negate it. So you need to do both. You do need to flip and negate it, because what you're saying there is that if the consequence isn't true, the rule has not been activated. And actually, there's a term for this, and the term for this type of writing is called the contrapositive. And that's another technical term. And I'll be using it in my videos, and it sometimes appears on the test as well. And that's basically what that means. It just means a rewriting of the conditional rule that you're given, but you're not changing the meaning of anything. It's still the same exact conditional relationship, conditional statement. You're just rewriting it from a different perspective. You're rewriting it in a different way. And the reason I'm introducing this is because there's situations where it's helpful to do that, and that's something that we'll encounter in future videos, and as you'll see when we get to them. Okay, so to summarize, conditional logic is the logic of if-then statements. And these statements act as rules with an activation and a consequence. And they can be either causal or constitutive. And an if-then statement generally functions as a rule, with the statement combined with another piece of information in order to make a deduction. And the if part is called a sufficient condition, and the then part is called a necessary condition. So when the sufficient is true, the necessary has to be true, and then when the necessary is false, the sufficient has to be false. Okay, so this is the first set of sort of ideas and concepts with respect to the basics of conditional reasoning. And in the next video, we're going to go over the remaining basic concepts.